Chi-Town. Yeah.
Drama.
What?
Purchase your tracks today.
Saludos. Gabe Morales back here again for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians, doing another segment on Chicago-based gangs. The Satan Disciples were allegedly founded in 1959 by King Satan in or near the North Lawndale area of Chicago near 15th and Talman. But I'm not sure that King Satan actually ever existed or just became gang folklore. At the time, the majority of North Lawndale was African American, but there was also a bastion of Eastern Europeans living east of the park. The first Satan Disciples were founded by about half Czechs and Polish males and other Eastern Europeans, but they also took in Mexican youths that made up about the other half of the gang. The original Satan Disciples were well-mannered, were well-dressed, even looked preppy, and they had their own band and even sponsored local teen dances. They took on the mascot of an old comic book character who was a little red devil with horns and pitchfork and forked tail named Hot Stuff that was very popular among teens back in the 1950s and 60s. So they adopted Hot Stuff as their mascot. The Satan Disciples, or SDs as they will be referred to often here, remained a very small club in the early 60s, but they did take some turf around 14th and Washtenaw as the neighborhood was changing, which caused the original chapter at 15th and Talman to close. The SDs did lose some numbers by the mid to late 60s due to some members getting drafted into the military in order to serve in the Vietnam War. As those members were drafted, they were replaced by younger, often Mexican youth, but also some Puerto Ricans, as well as a few whites and blacks. The Satan Disciples really started to grow at 18th and California, near Douglas Park, in the North Lawndale neighborhood, along with their 14th and Washtenaw turf. The SDs also landed in the near West Side community at Taylor and Racine, as well as operating in the heart of Italy, located in the West Pilsen area at 18th and Oakley. Now the SDs had several neighborhoods that they operated in during the early days. Right away, the SDs fought with gangs like the Gaylords, who were primarily white, as well as Ambrose and the Latin Counts. The Latin Kings did not yet have any territory in any of the SD sections in the early days. Thus, the show Gangland on the History Channel is not very accurate about the SDs being formed because of the Latin Kings. Most people will tell you that that is incorrect. And while I personally know a lot of guests who have been on Gangland, I found it often is not accurate. I know this because myself and my mentor, Mocha Morel, were on the very first episode featuring the Mexican Mafia. They totally mixed up the California Mexican Mafia with the Texas Mexican Mafia when they aired it, to our surprise. I also helped them out with a second episode on the Mongols motorcycle gang, and they messed that up. After that point, we stopped dealing with Gangland, but they got better as time went along. So I'm not trying to totally dog them, just stating some facts. And if you know, then you know. No, the Latin Kings were not the number one reason for the Saint Disciples getting together. They faced much larger threats from Ambrose, Latin Counts, and some vice lords that were much closer to their turf. They wouldn't be with the Latin Kings until later. By 1964, basically 5 years after they started, Latin Kings did start to push their way into Pilsen and Little Village neighborhoods. The Latin Kings wanted 18th Street in Pilsen and 26th Street in the Little Village, but this did not fly well with the gangs that had already been there, establishing turf. The Latin Kings were eventually able to set up shop along 26th Street, but 18th Street proved a much bigger challenge for them. And a lot of that is due to the Satan Disciples, who held it down at 18th in California, and even when they spread into 18th in Rockwell, solidifying their presence and keeping the Latin Kings out for the most part. By 1966, the Satan Disciples started to have war in their new territory at 24th and Washington when Big Augie and Little Augie arrived in the Marshall Square neighborhood. These guys would become gang legends, and eventually the SDs would spread up and down 24th Street between California Avenue and Western Avenue, with the biggest sections becoming 24th and Washtenaw and 24th and Rockwell. At 24th and California, the SDs and Latin Kings would clash for many years as both fought over that territory. The SDs also fought with the Morgan Deuces as well as the 2-6 and Cullerton Deuces by the 1970s. In 1971 or 72, King Satan was no longer the leader, and a guy named King Canary took over, when a major Satan disciple named Kingfish flipped to become a Gaylord. When Kingfish flipped, he convinced many of the original white Satan disciples to become Gaylords, and this is how the 18th and Western Gaylords began. These Gaylords felt threatened in their neighborhood that was becoming majority Mexican, and I'm sure they also had some racist tendencies. In the mid-1970s, Ambrose and Latin Counts were fighting for complete control of Pilsen, while the Latin Kings were trying to dominate the little village. The Satan disciples viciously fought all of these gangs, as well as the 2-6. Around 1975, the Satan disciples opened new turf on the northern part of Chicago in the West Town neighborhood. It was in this area that SDs fought with Latin Kings, just as they did in Pilsen and Little Village. In 1977, the SDs opened their first piece of Southside territory at 42nd and Campbell in the Brighton Park neighborhood. From there, the SDs opened up more territory in McKinley Park during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Gangster disciple King Larry Hoover wanted some Latino gangs in the late 1970s to aid him in his war with the Vice Lords and rival People Nation alliance that had recently formed that included the Latin Kings. Knowing that the Kings were rivals of many Latino gangs at the time, it did not take too much for King Hoover to convince them to join his movement. Also, by this time, the SDs started entering local jails and prisons in bigger numbers, but there was still a low number of the overall inmate population, so they needed allies. Thus, Satan disciples became folk by 1980, and they created a formal constitution as the Insane Satan Disciple Nation. Well before this occurred, the SDs hated Ambrose, as was discussed in earlier episodes, and the two gangs were arch enemies way back in the 1960s and for a good part of the 70s, especially after Ambrose leader Luis Limas shot SD Mark Rodriguez in the leg and shot Fidel Perez at 16th and Fairfield on October 19, 1974. Yes, Ambrose and the Satan disciples feuded before they went to prison, but the Folk Alliance often made them allies out on the street in the early 1980s. The SDs were also very close to the maniac Latin disciples, who were also part of the Folk Nation, as well as Black disciples, Gangster disciples, and Spanish Gangster disciples, as well as cooperating with Simon City Royals. Each of these gangs will be covered in future episodes. Out on the streets, by 1980, the Satan disciples opened up a section at 51st and Wood in the Back of the Yards neighborhood. It was in this neighborhood that the SDs rivaled with the Almighty Saints, as well as fighting with gangs like the Latin Kings and Bishops. At this time, the SDs allied with Ashland Vikings and Harrison Gents in the West Town section. In about 1980 or 81, King Canary was no longer the leader of the SDs, and Agapito King Augie Villalobos stepped into the role of leading the gang. Under King Augie, the SDs opened up new territory in Chicagoland. King Augie was even able to run the organization after he was incarcerated in 1983 for armed robbery. And while there had been tensions between them before, everything changed forever, as was discussed several times previously, when on November 7, 1986, the Satan disciples and 2-6 would reach a breaking point. It was at this time when Ambrose became embattled with 2-6 from the 28th Street area over a girl or over disrespect, or both, depending on who you listen to. And they proceeded to drive to their neighborhood and shoot at them in the K-Town area of the Little Village. The 2-6 got revenge by crashing the party at 63rd and Washington, which was Ambrose territory. The group of 2-6 opened fire, shooting several people, including killing a 2-2 boy as well as 2 Satan disciples. After this, the Satan disciples declared war on the 2-6, which, as I mentioned in previous videos, became a legendary war that supposedly never ended. Yet I saw recently that Sir Crazy from the SDs and P-Dog from the 2-6 made a rap video together. So you just never know with these kinds of things. I guess their mutual hate for the Latin Kings overruled any old 1986 beef. I mean, for the younger generation, that was 36 years ago. They weren't even born yet. All both hoods know now is the Kings are gunning for them today. In 1993, the Satan Disciples opened up territory in the Gage Park neighborhood at 59th and Spalding, and the SDs became a permanent fixture in the Gage Park area for many years. This area was contested heavily by Crown Town Latin Kings. In 1995, King Augie was released from prison, but soon found out that he was not embraced by all of the SDs. Many of the younger SDs told King Augie that he should not be the leader, and they wanted his second in command, Danny Gizmo Valencia, to run the SDs as their new king. But in November 1995, Gizmo was shot and killed. Many say that his own gang killed him, or more specifically, King Augie's supporters, and that the hit was ordered by none other than King Augie. After that, the SDs never had another king. As the 1990s progressed, the SDs had grown into several thousand members, becoming one of the largest street gangs in the city. They often made the newspaper for horrendous crimes. So I'm not glamorizing them. They victimized their communities. Like many other gangs, they have birthdays. For instance, the Latin Kings often celebrate All Kings Day, which is January 6th. For the SDs, it is May 3rd of every year. This falls very close to annual Cinco de Mayo celebrations, which will draw large crowds, so it is good cover to hold gang meetings. It is also a good opportunity for enemies to strike at them en masse. This is not unique to Chicago. These birthdays and large annual festivals happen in many parts of the U.S., and I have been part of many police intelligence meetings where this was discussed. Before I forget, gang funerals are also a sure occasion for members to show up en masse to pay respects to their fallen homie. There's also an opportunity for rivals to show further disrespect. Thus, there's often a large police presence. For some of you cops out there that are not up on gangs, maybe you should be, because like I said, this happens all over the U.S. If it hasn't yet, it will. I've heard some say that the SDs will celebrate May 24th, which is the birthday of King David Barksdale, founder and original king of the Black Disciples. I'm not sure if that still happens in Chicago, but I do know in Seattle, we often see a rise in gang activity at the end of the month. Now, one might surmise that is because money is often tight in the hood at the time, and there might be some tension of supply and demand in the drug world. But there is another reason. We have a very large contingent of gangster disciples from 21st and 28th Avenues in the Central District of Seattle, and either they or their enemies often conduct missions at that time, especially the youngsters who want to make a name for themselves. The SD's official colors are canary yellow and black and sometimes red, which follows the colors of their mascot. Gold and black are the official colors of the Latin Kings, so it is very easy to mistake them for each other. Like I said, the SDs gained heavy influence from the gangster disciples, and GD King Larry Hoover recommended that they become part of La Tabla under the Spanish gangster disciple concept. Hoover was very business savvy. He was very good at figuring out ways to make money and make more money. It is one of the main reasons for his rise to power. At the same time, Hoover was rising to the top of Chicago's gang world. The SDs were trying to get there too. They were not nearly as large as the GDs or their rivals, the Latin Kings, but they admired Hoover and his ways of operating. So a lot of their constitution was copied directly from Hoover's directives to his followers. The SDs quickly became known for being pro-business and were very good at drug sales, which they barely coded in SD Law Number 7 in their written constitution and in their bylaws, using the phrases free enterprise and business when talking about illegal drug distribution and sales. SD Law Number 7 reads, all members are entitled free enterprise. We shall be the only one that should have free enterprise in our communities. No one outside the organization is allowed to start or have a business in our communities. So basically, they're saying they control all business, either by owning it or extorting it, or there will be retribution. Like I said, they prey on their own communities. They're not part of the Better Business Bureau or Chamber of Commerce. Their constitution and bylaws also specifically directs that 2 bank accounts be established for each section or faction of the gang. And word for word states how to organize the income. Every member will pay dues of $3 a week. $1 will stay in the section's treasury. You will receive $2. You will start 2 bank accounts that $1 will go into each one. So depending on how many members are in each section is what you should receive and leave in the section's account for them to build an account for business ventures or emergency matters. But before they can use any finances, they would have to report to you, the treasurer. Almost makes them sound like a legitimate corporation, doesn't it? In the 1980s and first half of the 1990s, the SD had spread into many Chicago suburbs, and especially into the suburb of Cicero, Illinois in 1992. It is said that Bobby D. and Waco D. brought the SDs to Cicero at that time. The SDs have also been identified in Arlington Heights, Burbank, Darien, Glendale Heights, Justice, Illinois, Naperville, Oak Lawn, Plainfield, Prospect Heights, West Chicago, and many other parts of the greater Chicago area, as well as being identified in Aurora, Illinois, Danville, Joliet, Mount Vernon, Rockford, and many other parts of the state. They can also be found sometimes outside of Illinois, like in Washington state, but I think there's only like 2 or 3 that have ever been identified there, in spite of some studies and researchers making it sound like they might have a large presence. They are not that well known outside of the greater Chicago, Illinois area, but that makes their command and control much easier for their chiefs. Most Satan disciples are not true devil worshippers, even though they often use devil symbols. Their oath says, calling upon God to witness to do what one says, or witness that one sincerely intends to do what one says. And one of their main prayers says, you'll never be forgotten. Please watch over our sisters and brothers, your children, for whom we are praying for at this special moment. In this world of hate, pain, and sorrow, we have all grown to know. We are thankful for the happy moments you have given us to share with them. We know that they are happy and safe in a world of love, life, and loyalty. They are not forgotten, nor shall they ever be, for they are deep within our hearts, minds, and souls. We know and believe that there is a reason for all of this, and we shall trust in you as long as our nation's life and memories exist. Now, as a family and a nation, we pray that our sisters and brothers, your children, will live in the glory of your kingdom forever. In memory of you, sisters and brothers, we miss you so, but you'll never be forgotten. Almost makes them sound Christian-like, doesn't it? Like I said, King Augie was booted out of the gang, and they never had another king again. After it was felt several leaders or kings had abused their authorities over the years. So I'm told the gang is now run by a council of chiefs. Let me know if that is accurate or totally BS. We like to stay accurate here on this channel, and I know that there's a lot of inaccurate information out on the internet and some YouTube broadcasts. We are not perfect, but we're trying to get it right. The SDs often function in a very organized crime manner. Would only leave a turf if it was more profitable to invest more in another area. Using a very smart business sense, the SDs have grown their profits over the years and have opened several legitimate businesses. I have heard some people state that there are almost 10,000 members nationwide. I think that's quite a bit over their current numbers, but they are a large gang, and the reason why we discussed them here. And they're definitely a gang to watch out for in the greater Chicago area. In 2021, there was a bust of 10 Satan disciples in Lake County, Illinois. Investigators say they stopped at least 2 planned drive-by shootings ordered by the gang and got more than 4,000 grams of cocaine and 170 grams of methamphetamine off the streets, as well as seizing thousands of dollars. Now, some of you youngsters seeing this may be telling yourself, damn, look at all that fast money. But let me ask you to think for a minute. How long do you really think you'll be around to spend it? Those guys won't. They'll be in prison for a long time, for some of their best years, eating top ramen noodles and being away from everything they love. So is it really worth it? I hope you enjoyed this episode and maybe learned a thing or two. As always, thanks a million to our many cop friends in the Chicago area. We hope that you are safe and in good spirits, in spite of the anti-cop sentiment in many areas. I'd also like to thank ChicagoGangHistory.com and many others who assisted with this documentation as I continue covering some of the major gangs described in my book, co-authored by retired Chicago PD Gang Detective Joe Sparks. called Chicago-Based Gangs, Young Folks and People.
Purchase your
Until
tracks
next
today.
time, this is Gabe Morales signing off for Gangsters, Cops, and Politicians.